No, it is not on. What does that do? That's dreadful. It's a pleasure to present to you tonight Noam Chomsky, who is Institute Professor of Linguistics, the Massachusetts Institute of Technology. In 1957, Professor Chomsky published a small book, 118 pages, including bibliography, called Syntactic Structures, that I think it would be fair to say revolutionized our understanding of language and our approach to language. In subsequent years, Professor Chomsky continued to publish significant works on language, including Cartesian Linguistics, which Time magazine labeled one of the 10 most significant books of the decade. He has, in '75, delivered the Wooden Lectures at McMaster University in Hamilton, Ontario, the Nehru Memorial Lectures at Delhi, India in '72, in 1970, the Bertrand Russell Memorial Lectures, Trinity College, Cambridge, England. In '66 to '67, he was visiting Beckman Professor of English, University of California at Berkeley. Professor Chomsky, who comes to us to speak to us tonight on the state and the intellectual, has clearly and easily established himself as a leader in the American intellectual community. In 1969, Professor Chomsky published The American Mandarins and the New Power. He was active in the efforts to wind down the unfortunate Vietnam War. He has established a second career for himself as a critic of American society, a spokesman about social issues, and so he is in two ways uniquely qualified to speak to us tonight on the intellectuals and the state. Mr. Chomsky.
There are two topics that I would like to touch on in these remarks. The first one is a bit abstract, the second more concrete. The first and more abstract one has to do with the roles that intellectuals tend to play in modern industrial society, which is a topic that has been a lively one, at least since the Dreyfus affair in France, when in fact the term intellectual first came into common usage, and a committed group of intellectuals took a committed stand on an issue of justice. And in this context, I also want to comment on the engagement of American intellectuals in the ideological battles relating to the First World War, when a prominent group of liberal intellectuals, including John Dewey, Walter Lippmann, and others, described themselves in their terms as a new class engaged for the first time in applying intelligence to the design of social policy, kind of philosopher kings, in effect. And after having discussed this sort of generally and with a few historical remarks, I want to turn to the contemporary scene and to consider the contributions of the new class to constructing the moral and ideological framework that will be appropriate for the exercise of the power of the American state in what is sometimes called the post-Vietnam era. And I will try to show that some rather striking features of contemporary ideology can be understood within the framework suggested in these preliminary and more general observations. Well, starting with the more general one, what are the roles that the intelligentsia as a group tend to play in modern industrial society? There's a classic analysis of this question about a century ago in the works of Bakunin. It was he, to my knowledge, who first used the phrase new class in reference to what he called the scientific intelligentsia. And in a series of analyses and predictions, which may be among the most spectacular within the social sciences, Bakunin warned that the new class will attempt to convert their access to knowledge into power over economic and social life. I'm quoting now. They will try to create the reign of scientific intelligence, the most aristocratic, despotic, arrogant, and elitist of all regimes. There will be a new class, a new hierarchy of real and counterfeit scientists and scholars, and the world will be divided into a minority ruling in the name of knowledge and an immense ignorant majority, and then woe unto the mass of ignorant ones. Though he was a passionately committed socialist himself, Bakunin did not spare the socialist movement the force of this critique. He wrote that the organization and the rule of society by socialist savants is the worst of all despotic governments. And as far as the liberal democracies are concerned, though preferable to absolutism in his view, still, he said, liberal democracy, I'm quoting, serves to conceal the domination of the masses by a handful of privileged elite. He predicted that, this was a century ago, remember, he predicted that capitalism will develop in the directions of increased state centralization, while the sovereign people will submit to the intellectual governing minority who, while claiming to represent the people, unfailingly exploit them. The people, he wrote, will feel no better if the stick with which they are being beaten is labeled the people's stick, as in liberal democracy. Under either system of governance, state socialist or state capitalist, quoting again, the shrewd and educated will gain privileges, the mercenary-minded will find a vast field for lucrative underhanded dealings, and regimented working men and women will sleep, wake, work, and live to the beat of a drum. Now this is all, in my view, quite a remarkable analysis. A century later, Bakunin's new class is a cliche, a rather grim cliche. State centralization has indeed proceeded, pretty much as he indicated it would in the capitalist societies, along with and always closely linked to the centralization of ownership, control, and power in the central economic institutions that set the basic conditions for social life. By the turn of the century, there already were quite close links between corporate control and management on the one hand and university-based programs in technology and industrial management on the other. There's a recent and quite interesting book by Dave Noble called America by Design that deals with this question. And in more recent times, there has been an increasing flow of technical intelligentsia through the universities, the government, foundations, management, major law firms that represent broad interests of corporate capitalism, and in general throughout the whole tightly linked network of planning and social control. The intellectual governing minority never does tire us of telling us how the people rule while concealing the real workings of power, a fact which is occasionally studied and is quite easily documented when it is studied. The real and the counterfeit scientists have been responsible for innumerable atrocities themselves and for the legitimation of many others while wielding the people's stick. I will not dwell here on the performance of what Bakunin called the red bureaucracy when they have succeeded in centralizing state power in their hands, riding to power on a wave of popular movements that they have proceeded to dismantle and finally destroy. Well, ideas of a similar type have been expressed repeatedly throughout the past century. There's no time here to go through examples. As I say, Bakunin was perhaps the first, to my knowledge, the first to develop these ideas in any detail, and also perhaps the best. In more recent times, one hears similar views expressed by quite a range of people, sometimes by the people who call themselves post-industrial theorists, Daniel Bell, John Kenneth Galbraith, and others, although this reiteration of basically the same views involves a very different attitude toward the phenomenon described. Well, Daniel Bell, for example, says that he believes that, I'm quoting, the entire complex of social prestige and social status is coming to be rooted in the intellectual and scientific communities. Or John Kenneth Galbraith writes that power is shifting from its ancient association with land and its current association with capital to the composite of knowledge and skills which comprises what he calls the technostructure, and Galbraith and Bell as well both have high hopes for what Galbraith calls the educational and scientific estate, which is Bakunin's new class, ruling in the name of knowledge. Notice it's essentially the same analysis, though with an entirely different value associated with what they allege is happening. Bakunin also noted, as the post-industrial theorists do not, a kind of convergence, and I think an important one, between the intelligentsia and the state socialist and the state capitalist societies. And I think that's correct and important. For example, in later years, later than Bakunin, Lenin in 1918 proclaimed that, quoting, "Unquestioning submission to a single will is absolutely necessary for the success of labor processes that are based on large-scale machine industry. Today, the revolution demands, in the interests of socialism, that the masses unquestioningly obey the single will of the leaders of the labor process, namely Bakunin's new class." Well, compare those remarks, which are typical Leninist ideology, with the following dictum, quoting again, "Vital decision-making, particularly in policy matters, must remain at the top. God is clearly democratic. He distributes brain power universally, but he quite justifiably expects us to do something efficient and constructive with that priceless gift. That is what management is all about. Its medium is human capacity. It is the gate through which change in every dimension is rationally spread through society. The real threat to democracy comes not from overmanagement, but from undermanagement. To undermanage reality is not to keep it free. It is simply to let some force other than reason shape reality." So the idea is that reason demands submission to centralized management. This is true freedom. Popular involvement in decision-making is a threat to liberty, or, as the same author proceeds to say, it is a surrender to unbridled emotion and greed. Management is a mechanism, we're continuing to quote, whereby free men can most efficiently exercise their reason, initiative, creativity, and personal responsibility, so that we must therefore strengthen the institutions in which management can function successfully in its adventurous and immensely satisfying task. Well, apart from the reference to God, it would be very hard to determine whether this quote is from Lenin, or, as indeed is the case, Robert McNamara, a typical example of the scientific and educational estate in a state capitalist democracy. And this convergence is easily demonstrated, not only in such typical figures as these, but quite across the board, I think. Well, science has also been called upon to explain the need for submission to the talented leadership of those whom Isaiah Berlin once called the secular priesthood, a rather apt phrase. For example, Edward Thorndike, who was one of the founders of experimental psychology and a person who had great influence in the American educational system, he solemnly explained in 1939 the following discovery of modern science, quoting, "It is the great good fortune of mankind that there is a substantial positive correlation between intelligence and morality, including goodwill towards one's fellows. Consequently, our superiors in ability are on the average our benefactors, and it is often safer to entrust our interests to them than to ourselves. No group of men can be expected to act 100% in the interest of mankind, but this group of the ablest men will come nearest to the ideal. The argument for democracy is not that it gives power to men without distinction, but that it gives greater freedom for ability and character to attain power." Now just think what that means in a capitalist democracy. There is some complex of abilities, which including presumably avarice and lack of concern for one's fellows and cruelty and so on. But anyway, some complex of abilities, whatever it may be, which leads to wealth and power under these historical circumstances, and also indirectly but successfully leads to virtual control over the state as well. These abilities, whatever they may be, are closest to the ideal, and democracy permits the people with these abilities to rise to power, which is very good because they are our benefactors, given the correlation that science has established between intelligence and morality. Now suppose we add to this picture another assumption, which is a rather standard one. It's central to the modern justifications for meritocracy, and also it's central to contemporary economic theory, if you really look. And that is the assumption that people will only labor for reward. That is, that the natural state of human beings is to vegetate. And the only way you can get people to stop that, move out of that status, is to reward them properly. Well, it then follows, if you think about it, that the talented people have to be rewarded for the benefit of everyone, since they are, on the average, our benefactors, and since they're not going to do anything unless they get rewarded because the natural state is to vegetate. It therefore turns out that if they want them to act as our benefactors, we better reward them. Now, the conclusion, the bottom line of this argument is very simple. For the great mass of the population, the conclusion is you're better off if you're poor, because you should, in fact, accept powerlessness and poverty for your own good, because that's the only way in which you can get the talented to act on the basis of their talent. And since there is this lucky correlation between talent and morality, they will also be benevolent in the exercise of this talent. This is a rather interesting and significant device, one of the techniques of social control that's now being developed, to be sure not exactly in these words, but essentially with this kind of argument. It's a useful argument. It's a useful technique. You find it, for example, in some of the contemporary theories of meritocracy. This is the essential line of argument. And it's an important kind of technique of social control to try. I don't know how effective it'll be in a period when other techniques have failed. For example, the promise of endless economic growth, which did serve for quite a long time as a device for enforcing conformity and obedience. The secular priesthood has observed over the years that democracy poses some limits to power, and in fact some problems for the realization of the rule of reason, namely the rule in which everyone willingly submits to their benefactors. One of the problems in a democracy is that the voice of the people is heard, and therefore it's necessary to find ways to ensure that the people's voice speaks the right words. This problem was squarely faced by the eminent political scientist Harold Lasswell in the early 1930s in an article on propaganda in the International Encyclopedia for Social Science and in other work. He wrote that the rise of democracy complicated the problem of eliciting concerted social action. The spread of schooling did not release the masses from ignorance and superstition, but altered the nature of both and compelled the development of a whole new technique of control, largely through propaganda. Under democracy, propaganda attains eminence as the one means of mass mobilization which is cheaper than violence, bribery, or other possible control techniques. Going on, propaganda as a mere tool is no more moral or immoral than a pump handle, for it may be as readily employed to good as to bad effect. It is here to stay and will in time be viewed with fewer misgivings. The regard for men in the mass rests upon no democratic dogmatisms about men being the best judges of their own interests. The modern propagandist recognizes that men are often poor judges of their own interests. The modern conception of social management is profoundly affected by the propagandist outlook. Now, notice carefully the tacit assumption, that is, that there is no moral issue posed by a benevolent dictatorship which organizes social action through the means of propaganda in the interests of men in the mass who are by no means the best judges of their own interest. This is a very typical Leninist idea, a very typical doctrine of the new class, and another example of the convergence of which I spoke before. This same concept of the propagandist outlook and its necessity in a democracy as a technique of mass mobilization has been developed quite extensively elsewhere. Probably the prophet of this field is Edward Bernays, in fact, who more or less invented the field of public relations and has been honored for his contributions by scientific societies as well. He has interesting things to say about this, and they're commonly repeated both in the social science and business press. Bernays writes that leaders of major organized groups, with the aid of technicians who have specialized in utilizing the channels of communication, have been able to accomplish scientifically what we have termed the engineering of consent. This phrase quite simply means the application of scientific principles and tried practices to the task of getting people to support ideas and programs. The engineering of consent is the very essence of the democratic process, the freedom to persuade and to suggest. You get the line of reasoning. Since in a democracy people can say things and vote and so on, it's necessary to engineer consent to ensure that when they act or vote, they're saying the things that their betters, their benefactors and so on, understand are proper for them. A leader frequently cannot wait for people to arrive at even general understanding. Democratic leaders must play their part in engineering consent to socially constructive goals and values. And again, of course, business and its representatives in government will judge what is socially constructive, and the responsible intelligentsia will take over the task of engineering consent. Hence the aptness of Isaiah Berlin's phrase, secular priesthood. In effect, the task of the intelligentsia is to promulgate the state religion in a manner rather in the way in which the earlier priesthood promulgated their religion and also a system of social control. I might add that a couple of years after this particular article on engineering of consent appeared, Bernays was honored by the American Psychological Association for his substantial contributions to science and society. Well, recall his remark that the engineering of consent is the very essence of the democratic process, the freedom to persuade and suggest. Obvious question arises as to who has this freedom to persuade and suggest, which is the essence of the democratic process. Well, quite evidently, it's not evenly distributed across the population, nor should it be, notice, given the correlation between intelligence and morality. A measure of the actual distribution of the freedom to persuade was given in an interesting article in Fortune magazine, business magazine, in 1949, which claimed that at that time, 1949, quoting, nearly half the contents of the best newspapers is derived from publicity releases. Nearly all the contents of the lesser papers are directly or indirectly the work of public relations departments. And then the article goes on to make the by now familiar point that it is as impossible to imagine a genuine democracy without the science of persuasion as it is to think of a totalitarian state without coercion. That is, indoctrination is to democracy what coercion is to dictatorship, naturally, since in a democracy the people have to be beaten with the people's stick. With such insights as these, which are very widespread, we can begin to get a better picture of the role that the intelligentsia play in a capitalist democracy. And again, let me stress that it's interesting to compare it to the role that they play under state socialist systems, Leninist systems. Contrary to the illusions of the post-industrial theorists such as Bell and Galbraith, there's no reason to believe that power is shifting into their hands, although one should not underestimate the significance of the flow of trained manpower from universities to government and management, something which is by no means recent. As I mentioned, it was already extensive at the turn of the century. But the real function of the intelligentsia in a capitalist democracy is ideological control. That is, they must ensure that beliefs are properly inculcated, beliefs that serve the interests of those who have objective power, which is based ultimately on control of capital in the state capitalist societies. The intelligentsia, in other words, operate the pump handle, conducting mass mobilization in a way that is, as Lasswell observed, cheaper than violence and much better suited to the image of democracy. Now, all of the analysts who I've cited, and many others, distinguish between two categories of intellectuals, namely, on the one hand, those who associate themselves with external power or even try to share in it or to capture it, and on the other hand, those who combat it and try to limit it, to undermine it, and to dissolve it. These commentators differ in their evaluation of these conflicting social roles. That is, Bakunin admires those who limit and undermine centralized power, while Bell and Galbraith, I take it, are telling us that the proper, certainly McNamara, that the proper stance is to associate oneself with it and to exercise it, presumably in a more benign fashion. But whatever their attitude, they all recognize these two conflicting social roles. There's a striking contemporary analysis along these lines, which one should really read to understand contemporary society. It appears in to date, the major publication of the Trilateral Commission, which is a private organization of elites of Western Europe, United States, and Japan, founded by David Rockefeller in 1973, an organization which achieved a certain degree of notoriety when its members captured the positions of President, Vice President, National Security Advisor, Secretary of State, Defense, and Treasury, and a host of lesser positions in the last United States presidential elections. This book, which is called The Crisis of Democracy, is the work of scholars from the three trilateral areas, one American, Samuel Huntington, one French, and one Japanese. The crisis of democracy to which they refer arises from the fact that in the 1960s, segments of the normally quiescent masses of the population became politically mobilized and began to press their demands, thus creating a crisis, since naturally these demands cannot be met, at least without a significant redistribution of wealth and power, which is, of course, not to be contemplated. So we have a crisis. The trilateral scholars, therefore, counsel as the solution to this crisis more moderation in democracy. The message is very similar to an earlier one that has been repeatedly offered to the underdeveloped world, for example, by another distinguished political scientist, Ithiel de Sola Pool, a colleague of mine, who several years ago explained, quoting, that in the Congo, in Vietnam, in the Dominican Republic, it is clear that order depends on somehow compelling newly mobilized strata to return to a measure of passivity and defeatism from which they have recently been aroused by the process of modernization. At least temporarily, the maintenance of order requires a lowering of newly acquired aspirations and levels of political activity. This, he explains, is what we have learned in the past 30 years of intensive empirical study of contemporary societies. Hard science, you notice. And the trilateral scholars, in essence, are urging that the same lesson must be applied at the centers of industrial capitalism as well. Now, it's in this context, in the discussion of this crisis of democracy, when people other than the elites began to press their demands on the state, it's in this context that the trilateral study turns to the intelligentsia, who, according to their analysis, come in the two familiar varieties, which they call by the following names. The first category are what they call the technocratic and policy-oriented intellectuals, who are responsible and serious and constructive. And secondly, there are those who they call the value-oriented intellectuals, who are the bad guys, who pose a serious danger to democracy. Why? I'm explaining why in their terms. Because they often devote themselves to the derogation of leadership, the challenging of authority, and the unmasking and delegitimization of established institutions, even going so far as to delegitimize the institutions, I'm still quoting, that are responsible for the indoctrination of the young, such as this institution, for example, while sowing dissatisfaction and stirring confusion in the minds of the populace. And that's pretty bad stuff. With respect to our enemies, we, of course, despise the technocratic and policy-oriented intellectuals. We call them commissars or apparatchiks or something like that. And we honor the value-oriented intellectuals as the democratic dissidents. At home, however, the values are naturally reversed, and ways must be found to control the value-oriented intellectuals so that democracy can survive with the citizenry reduced to the apathy and obedience that becomes them, and with the commissars, who here we honor, free to conduct the serious work of social management without disruption from these unwashed masses. The intellectual backgrounds of all of this I've already discussed. It's interesting that the term value-oriented is used for those who challenge the structure of authority, the implication being that it is wrong, offensive, and dangerous to be guided by such values as truth and honesty, for example. If you look through the study, you'll notice that the trilateral scholars in their critique of the value-oriented intellectuals never try to show that they're wrong. These value-oriented intellectuals who they so fear and disdain are never criticized for being wrong or misguided or whatever in their conclusions and analysis. Rather, It's that by being committed to these dangerous values, such as truth, that they cause these problems for the responsible, serious, constructive types who are undertaking the work of social management and ideological control in the institutions responsible for the indoctrination of the young and also the not so young. It's striking throughout that subservience to the state is not regarded as a value, but merely as the natural commitment of the intelligentsia, at least their more honorable representatives. And again, this is entirely in keeping with this. People are simply examples of the type that Bakunin and other critics have invented. They don't realize that they're examples, but if they were more familiar with the literature on the subject produced by these value-oriented intellectuals, they would quickly recognize themselves. Well, as I mentioned earlier, the Dreyfusards and the liberal American intellectuals at the time of World War I were what one might think of as early examples of committed, engaged intellectuals, and I think it's fair to regard these two groups as really as variants of the two categories of intellectuals that are delineated and identified by the trilateral study. Those who denounced the injustice of the state at the time of the Dreyfus affair in France by no means dominated French intellectual life at the time. In retrospect, it looks as though they did, since they're the ones who people respect. But if you look back at the time, it was very far from true. They were a distinct minority group and a much reviled one. They typify the value-oriented intellectuals who have always been such a trial to their more sober colleagues. Consider, in contrast, the group of liberal pragmatists in John Dewey's circle who rallied to the defense of the American state during World War I. Well, the editor of the New Republic put it in these terms. He said that their most, in a letter to Colonel House, Woodrow Wilson's advisor, he wrote that their most fervent wish was to back the president up in his work and be the faithful and helpful interpreters of what seems to be one of the greatest enterprises ever undertaken by an American president. Now, at the time that he wrote, that great enterprise was what Wilson called peace without victory. And a few months later, war after the election, in which Wilson said he would do the opposite, typically, incidentally. And faithful and helpful they were. According to their own estimate, which may be exaggerated, I'm quoting, the effective and decisive work on behalf of the war has been accomplished by a class which must be comprehensively but loosely described as the intellectuals. The nation entered the war under the influence of a moral verdict reached after the utmost deliberation by the more thoughtful members of the community, namely the secular priesthood, the technocratic and policy-oriented intellectuals, or the commissars, to use a more accurate term. And in fact, it's interesting that this is all from the New Republic, these things I've been quoting at the time. And that was sort of, the official journal of American intellectual liberalism. This term commissars actually would be rather apt at that time. The techniques of propaganda that are described by later scholars like Laswell and so on were in fact developed and applied with a great deal of success during World War I. And in fact, they led directly to the explosion of the public relations industry shortly after. There is a side remark that one ought to make here, though it's unpleasant to deflate the self-image of the most thoughtful members of the community. The fact of the matter is that while the thoughtful members of the community, most thoughtful members of the community, I can't duplicate the rhetoric without quoting it, while these most thoughtful members of the community were reaching a moral verdict after the utmost deliberation, what was actually happening was a little bit different, namely, as we know in retrospect. The British had decided to organize a major propaganda effort in the United States and in manufacturing Hun atrocities and such things. And since their resources were naturally rather limited, they had to select a group as a target for these efforts. So they wisely decided to select as their target the most gullible and stupid group of people that they could find. So they picked the intellectuals. And this was extremely effective. In fact, this thoughtful verdict reached by this moral verdict reached by the most thoughtful members of the community was, as the British propaganda services were well aware and congratulated themselves about, very largely manipulated by the first major state propaganda effort of modern times, namely the British manufacture of, barbarous stories about the Huns and so on, which was all exposed after the war as fraud, but was very effective in leading to this moral verdict by the thoughtful members of the community at the time of the war itself. Well, Dewey himself had great contempt for what he called the pacifists. Pacifists in the context of this time doesn't mean what we mean by pacifists. It means people who were against the First World War. So he had great contempt for these people called the pacifists, who, in his words, wasted rather than invested their potentialities when they turned so vigorously to opposing entrance into the war instead of working for attainable goals within the growing chauvinist consensus. And he explained, quoting now, that squeamishness about force is the work not of idealistic but of moonstruck morals. The criterion of value lies in the relative efficiency and economy of the expenditure of force as a means to an end, which is a good, sober, pragmatic evaluation, which we have heard in other contexts since, without some of Dewey's qualifications. I might say that it's very common to criticize critics of pragmatism on the grounds that they're just criticizing a straw man, and that pragmatism is really much more sophisticated than what is being criticized. I think that response is hard to maintain if one actually looks at the texts, but decide that for yourselves. Well, I've so far been discussing the first of the two topics that I wanted to talk about, namely the roles that are played in general in modern industrial society by the intelligentsia, and I've been focusing on the role of commissar versus dissident, technocratic and policy-oriented intellectual versus value-oriented intellectual. And what I'd now like to do is to apply these remarks to the contemporary world. First, however, a few general comments about the nature of this contemporary world as I see it. After World War II, the United States emerged with unparalleled power and wealth. And quite naturally, American state power was employed to construct an international order which was quite comprehensive, though not all-consuming, all-encompassing, in which U.S.-based corporations would flourish. And equally naturally, this is not what one reads in most history books, although the facts, I believe, are quite well established. And the business press, interestingly, is often quite straightforward about the matter. For example, Business Week, when the war in Vietnam came to an end in April 1975, had a rather distressed editorial discussing the emergence of the post-World War II order and the dangers it was now facing. And they pointed out quite accurately that after World War II, quoting now, an international economic structure was established under which U.S. companies have flourished. No matter how negative a development, there was always the umbrella of American power to contain it. The rise of the multinational corporation was the economic expression of this political framework, which now they fear may be in jeopardy, which is quite an accurate description, and incidentally one which under the canons of American scholarship is called radical or Marxist, except when it appears in business journals when it is disregarded. In general, the global enterprise was a stunning success, though there were some reversals, and the most dramatic one, of course, being in Southeast Asia. In the course of this local failure, which in fact proved quite costly, U.S. power declined somewhat relative to American industrial rivals. And a major task of the state and its propagandists has been and remains to try to reconstruct the domestic and international order and the ideological system that was bruised, though never undermined, by the bloody events in Indochina. I should add at this point that ruling groups throughout the first world, so-called, the world of industrial capitalism, also have a stake in the reconstitution of American power, and particularly in ensuring that underdeveloped countries do not strike an independent course, but remain subordinated to the needs of the industrial democracies. The rich and the powerful of the world require a system of beliefs that will justify their dominant position, a new version of the white man's burden, and to construct this new ideology is the task of the intelligentsia. Well, in the United States, if you look over the years, the prevailing version of the white man's burden, or the French civilizing mission, has been the belief, which is carefully nurtured by the intelligentsia, that the United States, alone among the powers of past or present history, does not pursue the material interests of ruling groups, but rather is committed to abstract moral principles, like the Wilsonian principles of freedom and self-determination, or democracy, or human rights, and so on. Responsible controversy, what's called responsible controversy, proceeds within a rather narrow spectrum in American scholarship. At one extreme, one has the sometimes called orthodox view, the intellectuals who laud the United States for its unique benevolence. And at the other extreme, we have the so-called realist critics, people like George Kennan or Hans Morgenthau, who believe that we should pursue the national interest in a more serious way and not be so obsessively moralistic in our pursuits. The work of the realist critics gives the deepest insight into the dominant ideology and reveals quite dramatically, I think, the extent of its penetration in this quite fanatically ideological society. In the early 1960s, for example, and the time is interesting, Hans Morgenthau, who shortly after passed the limits of responsibility to his credit and became a serious critic, briefly, of American society. In the early 1960s, Hans Morgenthau was able to write that the United States has a transcendent purpose, namely the establishment of equality and freedom, and is thus unique among the nations of the world. I should mention, for those of you who aren't familiar with him, that he's the prototypical hard-headed, realistic critic of sentimentalism and so on and so forth. So the United States had a transcendent purpose, namely the establishment of equality and freedom, and is thus unique. And in fact, he says, whereas other nations only realized their purpose after they came into existence, in the case of the United States, it was different. The transcendent purpose existed, and then the United States came into existence to realize it. But we have this transcendent purpose. Well, he is a good historian, and he looked over the historical record, and he noticed that there were some departures from the ideal of establishing equality and freedom. There was a matter of slavery and other forms of oppression. There were a few things that happened in Central America and the Philippines and so on. But he says, well, these are kind of statistical error, basically, little things that they don't really change the picture. And Morgenthau, in fact, goes on to chide those critics who rely on the quite ample historical record to deny the transcendent purpose of the United States, and who claim that the United States is really very much like every other power. A critique which, oddly enough, is called a radical critique, which is a very curious choice of words. These critics, according to Morgenthau, are guilty of a simple error of logic. That's the way he describes it, quoting, "To reason thus is to confound the abuse of reality with reality itself. That is, it is the unachieved national purpose that is the reality, and it is the actual historical record that is the abuse of reality." And these critics who fail to see this are, of course, guilty of an error of logic. Well, the theological overtones of all of this are quite apparent, and Morgenthau is not unaware of them. He remarks that the critics who mistake the real world for reality have fallen into what he calls the error of atheism, which denies the truths of religion on similar grounds. And the comment is apt enough. There is something truly religious in the fervor with which responsible American intellectuals, including the critics, have sought to deny plain fact and to secure their dogmas with regard to American benevolence, which is simply the American version of the white man's burden and the civilizing mission. However, this religious system, though very well and deeply implanted in the 1950s and the early 60s, this religious system was not able to survive the war in Vietnam, at least among large parts of the population, and that has indeed led to an ideological crisis. The crisis is that the institutional foundations for the repeated counter-revolutionary intervention of the post-war years remains completely unshaken, but the religious doctrine that has served to gain popular support to ensure an obedient and apathetic population, supporting the crusade against independent development, and that's what it is, those that religious doctrine has collapsed. And the problem of the day is therefore to reconstruct it. There is also the problem of reconstructing the world order itself, which is the serious task. The lesser task is the problem of reconstructing the ideological foundations of it, is what is to be pursued by the secular priesthood. And I'd like to survey now some of the ways in which American intellectuals have risen to the occasion and are working to try to reconstruct the basis, the ideological basis for new interventions, trying to reconstruct this concept of the American civilizing mission, which was so battered in the late 1960s. And there are a number of facets to this. The first task, of course, is just to rewrite the history of the war, the American war in Vietnam. That task, incidentally, is relatively easy, since the press and academic scholarship, which I take it to be the two basic propaganda institutions, the press and academic scholarship have quite consistently held to the required mythical history through the whole period. According to the myth, the United States intervened, unwisely perhaps, to defend South Vietnam from aggression. Our good motives were transmuted somehow into bad policies. Scholars tell us that the United States didn't realize that Vietnamese communism was a nationalist movement. Planners thought that Ho Chi Minh was an agent of Moscow, or perhaps Peiping, as Dean Rusk used to say. The fault lies in error or misunderstanding, an excess of benevolence in undertaking a costly defense of a nation that was unwilling to save itself, and so on. There's no time, nor is this the place, to review the documentation that undermines this reading of history at every point. The record establishes, I think with absolute clarity, that top-level planners undertook perfectly consciously and knowingly to destroy the forces of what they knew to be Vietnamese nationalism, and did so on the basis of calculated and quite rational imperial strategy. When they failed in their effort to reimpose French rule, they launched a major war against the largely peasant population of South Vietnam, and later extended this aggression to the rest of Indochina, conducting military operations and nation-building programs of indescribable barbarism. But we can be quite sure that the custodians of history will present a different story, and since their position in the propaganda institutions is virtually unchallenged, they will succeed in this endeavor, and indeed already have. It's enough to look at the journals and the history books and so on to see that. A second and somewhat more difficult task is to try to shift the moral onus of the war to the victims of it. And this would appear at first to be a rather unpromising enterprise, rather as if the Nazis had attempted to blame the Jews for the crematoria. But undaunted, American propagandists are pursuing this task as well, and with some success. Things have in fact reached the point where an American president can appear on television and state, as Jimmy Carter did not long ago, that we owe no debt to the Vietnamese. Why? Because in his words, the destruction was mutual. And there is not a whisper of protest in the American press when this monstrous lie, which is really worthy of Hitler or Stalin, is blandly produced to an admiring audience in the midst of a discourse on human rights, no less. Not only do we owe them no debt for having murdered and destroyed and ravaged their land, but we may now stand back and sanctimoniously blame them for dying of disease and malnutrition. We can blame them because hundreds of people die trying to clear unexploded ordnance from fields laid waste by American terror. The only unresolved issue that remains is the MIA's, not the American responsibility to help reconstruct and rebuild what they destroyed. And worse yet, we refuse to let others aid them. Recently, for example, India tried to send 100 buffaloes to try to help in this trivial way to replenish the vast herds that were destroyed by American violence. This minuscule gift had to be channeled through the Red Cross to avoid American retribution, in this case, cancellation of food for peace aid. The peasants of Indochina pulled plows because the animal herds were destroyed by the violence of the American state, and the Washington Post and Time and Newsweek, which always concealed and supported that aggression, now publish photographs of Cambodian peasants pulling plows as an illustration of communist atrocities. In fact, The photographs in this case were probable fabrications of Thai intelligence, which were exposed long ago by the right-wing press in Thailand. The Post and Time and Newsweek know that these are fabrications, but they will not so much as publish a letter to that effect. And they know, incidentally, that their fabricated story about the source of the photographs is a lie. But they will not publish even a letter or retract these well-documented lies, which is one example, incidentally, of the stream of fabrication that is now disfiguring the American press with regard to post-war developments in Indochina. I've written about this and I think documented a good deal of it elsewhere, and I'm not going to repeat it here. The more crucial part in the present context is the obscene character of the effort to blame the victims and its quite astonishing success. A third task that the intellectuals have to undertake is to reduce what are called the lessons of the war to the narrowest possible terms. Now again, that's not very difficult, since the intelligentsia always construed the issues in a very narrow and entirely unprincipled fashion, contrary to what is widely believed. There's a remarkable illustration of this in the best study that I know of intellectual attitudes. There is a book by a sociologist at Columbia named Charles Kadushin. It's called The American Intellectual Elite. If you're willing to tolerate the absurdity of that concept for a while and look at the book, it does give you an interesting idea of what the group that he so identifies, which is really the group of the people who made most noise, you know, the most articulate, the ones who wrote the most articles and that sort of thing. It's a fair, I think it's a fair sample of sort of the American liberal intelligentsia, basically. He surveyed their attitudes with regard to a number of issues, primarily the Vietnam War. The book came out in 1974, but the survey was conducted in 1970. And you'll remember that that was the moment of the absolute peak of opposition to the war, when the campuses were closed down and the country was blowing up and so on. And it's very interesting to look and see what the attitudes were of the American intellectual elite towards the Vietnam War at this moment of the real peak of public protest and activism. He divided the response, everyone was against the war virtually. If you look, they were almost all opposed to the war. He then divided the interesting question is why, on what grounds? And Kadushin divided the responses into three categories, to which he gave the following names. The first category was ideological opposition to the war. The second was what he called moral opposition. And the third was what he called pragmatic opposition to the war. The terminology itself is rather interesting. The term ideological opposition covers principled opposition to aggression. That is, people who said, I'm against the war because it's a case of aggression, and I don't care whether it succeeds or not, but I'm against aggression. That was called ideological opposition to the war, which is, as I say, an interesting term. For example, had the same group been asked about their attitude toward, say, the Russian invasion of Czechoslovakia, I'm sure they all would have said that they were opposed on precisely those grounds. They couldn't have argued that it didn't succeed because it succeeded beautifully, and they couldn't have argued that it was too bloody because it wasn't bloody at all. So therefore, they would have had to argue that it was wrong because aggression is wrong, even if it succeeds, even if it's not bloody, and so on. But would anybody ever call that ideological opposition? Well, obviously not. It's only when one questions the divine right of the United States government to intervene by force that nasty and ugly words like ideological are attached to that position. That is, a consistent opponent of aggression is within the mainstream when he's talking about our enemies, but he's an odd sort of ideological weirdo if he criticizes the United States on those very same grounds. Well, the second category, the moral opposition to the war, that included people who thought that it was just getting too bloody, you know, or leaving too much blood spattered around and that sort of thing. The third category, pragmatic opposition to the war, is people who said, in effect, that it was too costly, that we couldn't succeed at a reasonable cost. Now, as the responses distributed, there was a very small group of ideological opponents to the war, really small. Moral opponents, there were more moral opponents. But almost the overwhelming majority were pragmatic opponents. That is, they were people who opposed the war on the grounds that we just clearly couldn't succeed and it wasn't worth it at the cost that it was then mounting to. That was approximately the same kind of response that was standard, say, within business circles at the same time. After 1968, you could read the same thing in the Wall Street Journal, in effect. And I think that, say, if an equivalent survey had been taken in Germany in 1944, you probably would have gotten a similar spectrum of responses. That's a very typical indication of what the intellectuals really were like during the 60s. One has the illusion that the intelligentsia were anti-war. Every study shows quite the opposite, that opposition to the war was negatively correlated with education. That is, the higher the level of education, the lower the level of opposition to the war. And that was consistently true. The reasons for the illusion are clear enough. That is, the articulate opponents of the war were, of course, the articulate people. That is, the small group of intellectuals who were opposed to the war made noise disproportionate to their numbers, as they usually do. But that gave a very misleading picture both of the nature of the opposition to the war and of the intellectual elite itself. The actual picture is the one I've just described. Well, as to the lessons of the war, since the war was always conceived in these narrow terms, namely cost, it's not a great problem to present the lessons of the war in those terms. And that's what you find if you look at, say, academic scholarship. For example, there was an essay by Edwin Reischauer, who's, one of the deans of American Asian scholarship and foreign policy a little while ago, in which he wrote the following. He said, it's called The Lessons of the War in Vietnam. The real lesson of the war, he said, is the tremendous cost of attempting to control the destiny of a Southeast Asian country against the cross currents of nationalism. That's the real lesson of the war. In other words, if the costs had been less, it would have been perfectly all right. And that's a very typical response. Incidentally, Reischauer in the same article talks about what he calls the real tragedy of the war. He says the real tragedy is not what we did to the Vietnamese or anything like that. He says the real tragedy of the war is that our assessment of Vietnamese nationalism was wrong. Namely, we assumed that Vietnamese nationalism was that Ho Chi Minh was his term, the frontline agent of the international communist conspiracy. But in retrospect, we see that that was incorrect. It was really a nationalist movement. We didn't understand that. If they'd had better courses at Yale when William Bundy was a student, we would have overcome that difficulty and so on. The fact of the matter is that there is an ample historical record, a very extensive historical record, which is always ignored by scholarship, and for very good reasons, because it's quite inconsistent with the state religion, namely the record of intelligence that's presented in the Pentagon Papers. Extremely interesting, and what it shows is that things were exactly the opposite of what Reischauer claims. It was not that planners first labored under the misconception that the Viet Minh were the agents of international communism and therefore decided to intervene. What happened was quite the opposite. First, they decided to intervene for very rational imperialist reasons, having to do with the role of Southeast Asia in the Asian system controlled by the United States. And having decided to intervene, they then attempted to construct a theory that the Viet Minh were the agents of international communism. In fact, there was no question, if you look at the policy planning documents in the late 40s, there was no question in the minds of the top planners that the Viet Minh, the so-called communist movement in Indochina, was the movement of Vietnamese nationalism. They say this over and over again in the clearest terms. And if you look at the intelligence record in later years, after the decision for intervention was made, you really discover something quite interesting and amusing. Namely, intelligence was asked, ordered, one might say, to produce the evidence that was required to provide an ideological justification for the American intervention, namely the evidence that this intervention was really a defense of the Vietnamese against international communism. And then there's a long series of reports in which the CIA and so on tried to find some evidence for international communist influence in Hanoi. And the results were quite disquieting. They said that, in fact, if you look at the records, they say that they were able to discover communist influence in every country of Southeast Asia except Indochina. And there they were able to find nothing, And, if you look, they're ludicrous. I mean, there's a report which says, well, we think we found some indication that there may be issues of Pravda somewhere in Hanoi, so maybe there's a connection somewhere. Or, maybe there was a message that got in through the Bangkok embassy or something like this. But they finally conclude there really is no contact. And what was the ultimate conclusion? Well, the conclusion was that the fact that there was no detectable contact between Hanoi and the international communist conspiracy is the final and definitive proof that Ho Chi Minh as a total creature and puppet of the international communist conspiracy, so loyal, in fact, that they can trust him without even sending messages to him to do their bidding. That's essentially what was concluded. But the way it looks in American scholarship is quite different. Namely, the illusion, total myth is created that planners didn't know that they were dealing with a nationalist movement, and had they only understood this, we wouldn't have committed this tragic error. Well, that's scholarship. The other main pillar of the propaganda system, the press, operates in very much the same way. I'll give you just one example. The New York Times, in its edit, which is regarded by many people as a kind of an anti-war journal, in its retrospective editorial when the war came to an end, I think it was about April 5th, 1975 or so, they pointed to what they called the decade of fierce polemics that had raged between the hawks and the doves and that had been tearing the country apart. And they said we must, they said Clio, the muse of history, will have to settle this profound conflict. We have to just watch with humility and silence and prayer while Clio makes up her mind, and so on. And then they went ahead to, that's a quote, then we went it with a little bit of a parody, but not too much. They went ahead to identify the contestants in this epic conflict that had taken place between the hawks and the doves. And the way it worked was this. The hawks were the people who thought that it would have been possible to preserve a non-communist, an independent non-communist South Vietnam by other means if we had fought harder. And the doves were the people who felt that to preserve an independent non-communist South Vietnam was always an illusion and a myth. There was no way to do it. Those were the hawks on the one side and the doves on the other. Now, there are two interesting comments to make about this editorial. First comment, notice, is that as the Times sees it, everybody in the debate, namely the hawks and the doves, was assumed that American government policy was to develop an independent South Vietnam. Now, the fact of the matter is that that's just a total absurdity. I mean, it's prima facie absurd to think that you invade a country and try to destroy its main nationalist movement in order to preserve its independence. You really need a strong argument to demonstrate that. And in fact, there were plenty of people who weren't convinced by that claim, contrary to what the Times believes, but those people are not part of the debate, right? The only people who are part of the debate are the ones who accept the basic premise of the American government propaganda system, no matter how absurd it is, namely that by invading South Vietnam and trying to destroy the rural population, the United States was committed to preserving the independence of South Vietnam. Unless you're willing to accept that ludicrous doctrine, you're not even part of the debate as far as the Times is concerned. The second point of interest is that if you notice, the hawks and the doves differ only on a very narrow tactical question, namely, could we get away with it or not? The doves said, yes, we could if we tried harder. The doves said, no, we couldn't. It was always an illusion. Now, of course, there were other people, like, for example, the peace movement, which probably included something like 2/3 of the population, judging by the polls at the end of the war, certainly a substantial number of people, who thought that it didn't matter whether we could get away with it or we didn't get away with it. It was wrong. It's wrong if you can't get away with it. It's wrong if you can get away with it. In fact, worse if you can get away with it. But that view is not part of the debate. That's the interesting thing. The Times doesn't feel it necessary to reject that view, or certainly not to refute it. Rather, that view can be totally ignored, right? Because the only issue that can be raised is the question of the tactical question of whether American goals can be achieved or cannot be achieved. Now, these examples illustrate some very interesting points about propaganda in the intelligentsia, I think. It's quite interesting to compare, in fact, what happens in a totalitarian system with what happens in a democratic system. In a totalitarian state, the mechanism of indoctrination and propaganda is really fairly straightforward and transparent, and we all recognize it. The state determines official doctrine, right? It comes straight out of the state propaganda agencies, easily identified, everybody knows what it is. You have your choice. You have to parrot it in public or else you're in trouble. But internally, in a sense, your mind is free. You can believe it, you can disbelieve it, whatever. It's easily identified. You can stake out a position with respect to it. If you decide to voice your opposition, you may be in trouble. How much trouble depends on how violent and totalitarian a state it is. But at least, as I say, internally, one can sort of identify the the position and adopt any attitude towards it. And in fact, the totalitarian state really doesn't care. They're good behaviorists. They care what you do. They don't care what you think. In a capitalist democracy, it works quite differently. Remember, in a democracy, the people have a voice, and therefore they have to think the right things, not just behave the right way. That is, we have to have a system which is cheaper than violence in a democracy, as Lasswell pointed out. So, therefore, a more complex system of indoctrination has to be developed. And the way it works is essentially this. The press and the scholars and the intellectuals in general are said to be fiercely independent, hypercritical, and antagonistic to the establishment, and in a kind of an adversary relationship. The basic principles of the state propaganda system are assumed on all sides of the debate, both by those who present the official position and by those who are the tolerated critics. And there's a real sharp contrast here to the totalitarian system. In contrast to the totalitarian system, the propaganda apparatus, the system of indoctrination under a democracy, doesn't merely stake out a position to which all must conform, rather, or which incidentally they may privately oppose. Rather, what it does is try to capture the entire spectrum of thought. That is, the official position at one extreme and the position of its most vocal adversaries at the other. And over the entire spectrum, the same tacit assumptions are accepted, presupposed, insinuated, but very rarely expressed. Well, I've already given a couple of examples of this. For instance, take the New York Times debate between the hawks and the doves. Notice again, they all, the extreme ends of the spectrum, but they all accept the same tacit presupposition. Namely, if the United States can get away with its intentions, that's perfectly legitimate. Or take the realist criticism of American foreign policy. Remember, the criticism is that it's too moralistic. Of course, the tacit presupposition is that it's moralistic at all, which is nonsense, of course. But the point is that everyone on the debate, from one end to the other, assumes that the United States is uniquely benevolent, and then the debate rages over whether this is a good thing or a bad thing. And there are many other cases. The democratic system of thought control is quite compelling and seductive. The point is that the more vigorous the debate, the better the system of propaganda is served, because the tacit presuppositions are more effectively instilled. And there's no doubt, I'm sure, that any propagandist will agree that it's much more effective to insinuate attitudes rather than to beat them into people's heads with a bludgeon. And it could be that some of the dramatic successes of the American propaganda system, which is really quite awesome in the past years, are due to this method of what you might call feigned dissent that are typically practiced by the intelligentsia. Well, let me turn last to a final task of the propaganda system, namely to restore the faith in our transcendent purpose. Now, it's not enough then to prove the evil of our enemies and to transfer to them the responsibility for what was done to them. We also have to show, we have to somehow reestablish our own moral purity. And here, events have passed with an almost mythic quality. I don't mean to suggest that it was planned, but only that the propaganda system rose quite magnificently to the occasion that was presented. What we've been watching for the last couple of years is, I think, a two-act drama, of which the first act might be called catharsis, and the second act perhaps rebirth or spiritual regeneration or something like that. In Act 1, the evil was all personalized and identified and then expelled. There was one evil individual in whom it was all encapsulated. We found it, we threw him out. Catharsis. Nixon complained, you recall, that the press was being unfair to him, and he was quite right, actually, although he failed to see the role that he was playing in the unfolding drama. That is, it was very important to be able to personalize all the evil and expel it in this fashion. The fact of the matter is that the things for which Nixon was criticized during the Watergate affair were not that far out of the ordinary, if you look. There were real criticisms that could have been made of the Nixon administration, but they weren't made. For example, there were real crimes, but they were never brought up. There was, for example, the crime of the Cambodian bombing, but that was never brought up, ever. Now, you have to be careful here. The Cambodian issue did arise, but in a very narrow form. That is, what arose was the question of the deception, the fact that, that the Cambodian bombing was not revealed to Congress. That was considered a crime. But the fact that the United States was carrying out massive and destructive bombardment of a peaceful and neutral country, which we recognized, that was never brought up at all. Notice again the crucial tacit assumption. That is, it is legitimate for the United States to exercise force and violence in the world to whatever extent it wishes, as long as it can get away with it, but it's wrong to deceive Congress about the matter. That was the issue that was brought up against Nixon at Watergate. I should say that you might ask the question, in what sense was the Cambodian bombing a secret bombing? We always talk about it as a secret bombing. That's the way it's referred to. Well, it was a secret bombing. But the reason it was a secret bombing is because the press decided to keep it secret. That is, there was no secret about the facts. In fact, shortly after the bombing began in March 1969, the intensive bombing. And about 5 days after the initiation of the bombing, the head of the Cambodian government, who we recognized, incidentally, he was our friend and ally, called an international press conference in Phnom Penh, in which he called upon the international press, pleaded with them to denounce these new crimes of the massive bombing and murder of peaceful civilians and villages and so on. Not a whisper from the press, because they were committed to secrecy. And in fact, a little bit later, the Cambodian government, which we recognized, remember, published an official white book, official government paper, in which they included specific details of people killed, places, dates, photographs, and so on from the American bombing. To my knowledge, there wasn't a word about it in the American press, not a word, It was only later, when open season was declared on Richard Nixon, that the press had the gall to claim that it was his fault that this was a secret bombing. And in fact, even today, they keep the thing secret. Even today, the press pretends that it was a bombing which was directed against military installations, which is perfect nonsense, at least if we believe the Cambodian documentation from the government we supported, which claimed quite to the contrary, that it was targeted against civilians. There's every evidence that that was correct. Well, in this and many other ways, Act One was successfully completed, and the evil was identified and expelled. Then the curtain rose on Act Two, rebirth, the discovery of human rights, our new transcendent purpose. As Arthur Schlesinger explained in the Wall Street Journal, quoting, "Human rights is replacing self-determination as the guiding value in American foreign policy." Now, in a perverse sense, that's correct, what he said. That is, to the exact extent that self-determination was the guiding value of American foreign policy in the era of Indochina and Cuba and Guatemala and the Dominican Republic and so on, to precisely that extent, human rights will be our guiding value in the subsequent era. Now, of course, that's not precisely what he had in mind, but that part is correct. The fact that he could even say that, and get away with it, is an indication of the intellectual and moral degeneration that has accompanied the triumphs of the quite awesome propaganda system. There's a lot more to say about this, and I haven't even said a word about the domestic analogs that ought to be mentioned, but it's getting late. Let me just offer you a little fable to try to get you to appreciate, at least what seems to me a way to get one to appreciate fully the range of these accomplishments. Imagine the following thought experiment. Imagine that, say, the Second World War had ended in a stalemate in 1944. That is, the Nazis, let's say, had been driven out of France and Holland, the Low Countries, but remained a major world power, and there was a sort of a stalemate at that point. They were intact among the ruins. And let's imagine that a stratum of dissenting intellectuals had emerged at that time who criticized Hitler for his errors in conducting a two-front war and destroying a valuable source of labor power with death camps and so on, and in general in reacting with too much brutality to the intolerable burdens placed on Germany at Versailles. How might they have proceeded at that time to reinterpret the contemporary scene? Well, perhaps like this. First, they might have explained the historic need for German power to be restored. Perhaps they might have invoked Martin Heidegger's theory that Germany alone can defend the classic values of humanistic civilization against the barbarians of East and West, not to speak of the hordes of Asia and Africa. And they might then have turned to the situation in what they would certainly have called occupied Europe, say France under American occupation, after the successful Anglo-American invasion of peaceful France, which, recall, was abetted by communist-led terrorists within, and which was not a general uprising, but rather a foreign invasion from without. They would have noted with considerable horror that under this occupation, and it was an occupation, recall that Eisenhower was exercising full responsibility for civil affairs within France under authority granted him by Roosevelt and Churchill. They would have noted with horror that under this occupation, the terrorists of the resistance undertook a really huge massacre of collaborators, which amounted to a minimum of 30,000 to 40,000 killed in a few months, according to the estimate of the French analysts themselves, the official French history of the resistance, basing itself on reports of the French gendarmerie, takes a minimum figure of 30,000 to 40,000 massacred within a few months, and amounting to no less than 7 million killed, according to the detailed studies of some collaborators who were able to escape the terror, and which are regarded as serious but exaggerated by basically the official history. Now, appalled by these monstrous events, the German dissidents might have even produced a judgment comparable to that of the editor of the New Republic, who explained recently, I'm quoting, that the American collapse in Indochina will read in history as among the ugliest of national crimes, June 1977. That is not what the United States did, but its failure to continue was criminal. And comparably, the Nazi effort to withstand the Anglo-American invasion will read in history as an ugly crime, as attested by the 7 million helpless victims. We can, of course, be certain that the 7 million victim story would have prevailed within the Nazi domains. Continuing, these analysts might have observed with dismay the terrible suffering of the people of France and England, not to speak of Russia, in the fierce winter of 1946-47, with production stagnating and the United States unwilling to grant the British a loan, even except under quite onerous conditions that reduced America to British vassalage, and so on. Perhaps they would have objected to an annual reenactment of the events at Auschwitz as indecent, much as some Americans feebly protest at the annual reenactment of the Hiroshima bombing, most recently last October in a Texas air show before an admiring audience of 20,000 people by the pilot of the Enola Gay. What we have witnessed in the United States and the West quite generally in the past few years is in many ways a grim parody of this invented nightmare. It has proceeded virtually without articulate protest, which is again a testimony to the power of the institutions of propaganda and ideology, the press and the academic professions, and in fact the notable commitment of large segments of the intelligentsia to establish power, even as they pretend to combat its excesses. 20 years ago, there was a rare and very perceptive study of the political economy of American foreign policy published by a group sponsored by the National Planning Association and the Woodrow Wilson Foundation. They observed quite accurately that the primary threat of communism is what they called the economic transformation of the communist powers in ways which reduce their willingness and ability to complement the industrial economies of the West. That is accurate and a rare statement of the truth. The problem remains and will continue to inspire Western antagonism to independent development, which is generally led by a state socialist leadership that quite often follows the grim model of Bakunin's red bureaucracy. In an era of growing material resource shortages and resource competition, the so-called North-South conflict may lead to new forms of still unimagined horror, while stagnating economies in the West, unable to absorb a superfluous class of unskilled workers, will have to find ways to implement the proposals of the trilateral analysts as to how to induce passivity and obedience in the interests of something called democracy. Those who may be concerned about unemployment for intellectuals need not worry too much, in my opinion. Under circumstances such as these, there should be considerable need and ample opportunities for the secular priesthood. Thank you.